welcome to another episode of Crossroads, a casual conversation between friends that just happen to be pastors, and we explore the intersection of our Christian faith and the culture of the world. My name is Brian Bethke. I'm the pastor of Middleton Congregational Church, and I'll be the host today. And joining me, as always, is Rick Harrington. He is the pastor of First Baptist Church in Haverhill. I have Dave Hammer, pastor of Danville Baptist Church in Danville, New Hampshire, and Michael John, the pastor of Market Street Baptist Church in Amesbury, Massachusetts. So, gentlemen, so far in our first two episodes, we've been talking about some pretty hefty topics, some things that are very relevant, and par for the course, we're going to jump into another one today. And so, one of the things that we've been seeing a lot is there's been kind of this sense of not really an understanding of our bodies, like our physical bodies. And we've seen this kind of show up in kind of this idea of like gender confusion or gender, there's 72 genders, there's all these things, and there seems to be a lot of confusion today about gender, our bodies. And so what I'd like to do today is just kind of talk about, like, what does the Bible say about this? What are some things we should consider? And then what's the pastoral response as we encounter people in our everyday lives, in our congregations, and just people in our families, and how do we deal with that? So I kind of want to just kind of frame that for people that might be watching for us. Okay. And so as we go, let me kind of give the biblical kind of framework, and then I'll just throw it to you guys and hear what you have. So we read in Genesis 1:26 through 31. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.' Then God said, 'I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give you every green plant for food.' And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good." Then we read in Genesis 2:7 a little bit longer. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils and the breath of life, and the man became a living being. This idea of kind of a reiteration of that first chapter of Genesis. Then finally in Genesis 5 we read, "This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind when they were created." So guys, what I kind of want to ask you is, what overall are these verses saying about the created order? I mean, it's a big question, but what are they saying? Rick, you want to give it a stab?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's such a foundational passage of the Bible, the very beginning, and the idea that there is a creator, that there is a God, there is a divine, that makes us, and that means he's put us here for a reason. There must be some purpose behind why we exist. And I love the statement that after he creates, it says, "It is good, it is good, it is good." And then he makes human beings, and he says, "It is very good." So that there's a purpose behind why we exist, and there's a goodness to what he has made, that the physical world is good and ordered. The way he sets up creation is sort of described as having a specific order to it. So.
Yeah, explain this very good concept to me, because when we kind of read this, we kind of see this like good, very good. Mm-hmm. But why does it matter that God says it's very good? Like, what is that? Who cares? Like, it's very good.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're wanting me to say, but I
whatever you want to say, Dave.
Everything that God makes is good, and you can see that by looking around the world and looking at nature, looking at the sky. But one thing that's different, that when God, on the sixth day of creation, and God creates people, is that people are the only thing created in God's image. Mm-hmm. And so there's something unique about people in all the world. I just leave it at that.
Yeah, and I think this is the culmination of creation. All things are finished. and everything was good along the way, but now we see what he's created all things for, and that not only does he create us in his image, but then he gives everything to us, to mankind. This is something that we cannot stress enough, the sanctity and the dignity of every single human life. Yeah. And no matter, from the greatest, from the kings to the paupers, to those, even to those who are mentally unstable, to handicapped, to old, to young, to the unborn, to every single human being made in the image of God, and all of creation was made for mankind, male and female, but beginning with that premise that there's something really special about us, something very good about us.
Yeah, when we look at that creative order too, and we talk about, I love what you're talking about, this, we're image bearers, and there's a uniqueness to human beings, and that we are the only ones that could create image bearers that reflect the glory of God. And so as we kind of take this out of God, so God's a creator that shows us, well, what does it tell us about our physical bodies?
That they're good. I think that good is a moral, or at least a value statement, right? So you kind of touched on this in our last discussion, Brian, that good and evil are kind of, they already kind of beg the question of a divine lawgiver, right?
Yeah.
So when God sees creation, it's not just something that is, it's just matter, it's just stuff. There's actually a value to it, and even a morality to it. And as it's created by God, without sin in the world, without evil or fallenness, it's good, it's valuable. It has a purpose, an intention that God gave it, and it has something that we can actually look at and say, this is a positive thing that exists.
Yeah. You don't often see common cause between conservatives and liberals on the environment, but let me just try and draw an idea from environmentalists. An environmentalist looks at, say, water or a mountain, and they say, this is not just raw material for industrialists to do whatever they want with. There's something good in the very essence of the ocean or a lake or a mountain, and it's not just for us to do whatever we want and make as much money with it as we can. And we'd want to say from Genesis that the same thing is true of our bodies, that bodies are not just raw material to do with whatever, anything and everything we want, even for a person to do with their own body whatever they want. It's inherently good and even sacred, created by God to display God's image. So there's a real goodness about the body.
Yeah, it's very common in certain spiritualities to ignore the body. That doesn't really matter what you do with your body. It's your spirit that counts.
Right.
And we even have that phrase about how we think about the things that we do, and we excuse them as if, because my intentions are good, it doesn't really matter what I do with my body. Yes, I may have cheated on my wife, but I'm not an adulterer. Because I would never do something. I say this to my wife sometimes. I said, I would never hurt you intentionally. As if that suddenly excuses all the times that I might hurt her. But the things that we do with our body matter, and whether we intend them to or not, we possess bodies, and we are responsible for them and how we use them. So yeah, the bodies are you cannot separate the use of our bodies with our faith and our holiness. I think that's one of the points in Corinthians, where he says that, don't you know that anyone who, for example, has sex with a prostitute becomes one with her?
Yeah.
And don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? Don't you know this? And so there's always something very precious about the body.
Yeah, and there's this idea, like, I love, so like that Genesis 2:7 verse, this idea in which God takes the physical creation, the dust of the ground, and then breathes life into it. And then, again, it's very good. And then we look forward, we see that God comes to us in the flesh, in the person of Jesus Christ. He didn't come to us as a spirit, he came to us as the second Adam, Jesus Christ, which is declaring that creation is good, that the body is good. So let's take this. So we have a creator, our bodies are good. So what do these verses say about gender, and why does gender matter?
So, one of the things that's brought out is that he's made male and female.
Yeah.
So there is a binary sort of creation, and that the image of God is made male and female. which I think is very interesting, that we exist in that binary male-female gender, and that together reflects the image of God. So male by himself doesn't reflect the image of God entirely.
Right.
Female by herself doesn't reflect the image of God entirely, but there's something about the two of them together reflecting the image of God and being very good.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the binaries, Rick, because we look at God and his creation, how he creates. Even as we look at the entire Genesis account of creation, we see that God creates day and night. He creates, land and sea. He creates in distinct binaries that have boundaries, that have clear-cut boundaries, and in some way, those binaries display his glory.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. So then we come to gender, male and female. Yeah. And so what else? What's the importance of that? Like, I know what you just said, but what else? Like,
before we get to that, I have a question, and that is, it's a question that we used to never have to ask before, but we have to ask now. What's the difference between a man and a woman? What is, I feel like I'm in kindergarten again. Mm-hmm. Dave, what's the difference between boys and girls? What do we say now? How would you, I'm going to throw that out to you guys here. How do we define male and female now? What does it mean to be a male? What does it mean to be female?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that as we look at this, I'm just going to jump right in there because I just am. So I think it's one of these things where when we look at the biblical account, there is no construct for a gender fluidity at all, and you cannot separate gender and biological sex. That's clear in there. That if you have a penis, you're a man, and if you have a vagina, you're a woman. Mm-hmm. Like that's what it is. Like that's just, you don't see any other construct in Scripture on that. And I think, that's to break it real basic.
Yep.
That's basically what I would say.
Okay. So, but the physical, particularly the reproductive organs, because everything else between us is really roughly the same. We all have legs and arms and hearts and livers, but it's the reproductive organs that we really see the obvious distinction between the two.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think part of that, if we look at it too, one of the mandates that God gives when he creates is what?
Be fruitful and multiply.
Be
Right?
fruitful and multiply,
yeah, right.
which is, it's this idea in which we are the only people are the only, male and females are the only people in the creative order that could make other image bearers that are meant to have dominion over God's creation and reflect his glory and his goodness. Yeah. And
but it is interesting that you do see that male-female echoed throughout nature, though, so that the animals are also called to be fruitful and multiply. So the image bearers are that sort of the example of that kind of par excellence, right? But that male-female sort of dichotomy is sort of echoed throughout almost all of creation. So
yeah.
But the difference you see is that in the first institution that God makes is marriage, of the two becoming one, male and female coming together as one, whereas that is not something you see in the animal world, where they may have sexual relations, but there's no sense of covenant of oneness coming together. In fact, usually, they'll just, a lion will have how many lionesses at his bidding and so forth, and does his thing, and then goes off by himself. Whereas the human family, we recognize the importance of that, of a mother and a father, or the male and the female, two complementing, completely different, yet coming together as one. And that seems to be the reflection of God, the Trinity, that we would see.
Yeah. So I want to throw this at you. This is a quote from a transgender feminist activist who wrote, named Camille Paglia, I think that's how you pronounce her name. She writes, "Fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do as we see fit." Mm-hmm. So how does this differ from the biblical perspective? And where's this obviously this I'm just gonna, she's saying this because I'm guessing, there's a sense in which she doesn't feel at home in her body as many don't. Mm-hmm. So what's going on? If the body's good and things are good, she, again, this is fate has given us, not God. We have absolute claim over this. How does this differ from the biblical perspective? And then speak maybe on like the feeling behind that. That maybe we don't know what she feels, but behind that, like what's going on here?
A starting point of her thought is that we're in a world without God, and so everything's here by a result of chance and time, and the world and our very bodies are just raw materials to do. Who's to say that we can't do what we want with our bodies? And I mean, I can see where that's coming from. Yeah, but that's a totally different way of looking at the world and our bodies. Whereas Christians, we would say, what are these bodies for? We're going to look to the one who created them to understand that.
Yeah. I mean, I think again it goes back to the moral law comes from a giver, an authority. So, if we are simply matter, protoplasm, what it does at this temperature and this time, and this gravitational pull, and this just the process of a lengthy, billions of years and nothing more, just a purely materialistic world, what she's saying makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense to say this is simply the biological result of a long, long process that simply happened by random chance, and we are no more. Then what does it matter what we do with our bodies? Which is, we say, well, how is that different from the scriptures? We kind of said, if we're created by a creator, then that instills purpose to our existence, but also, as he says, value and morality, because it is good. There's a goodness to the natural order in which he created. So those are a pretty stark difference between what she's saying and saying there's a creator who has instilled value, meaning, and purpose into why we are here.
I love this quote, actually. I think she really captures what's at the heart of the gender confusion problem, which is a rebellion against the order of God, the way he created it. And it goes back to the Garden of Eden, and you shall be like God. You take this knowledge, you get to define now who you are, and you get to define things for yourself. And as a Christian, as those who believe in God, the position of faith is, I don't get to define anything. I live under the definitions that have been provided for me. I submit to these things, and whether I feel them or not, we go by, faith comes from hearing the word. Faith is not how we feel about things. And so when God has spoken and said, I've created you male and female, he's very clear about this. And to submit to that basic order of whether I feel it or not, he's created male and female. But she actually captures perfectly the force and the sentiment behind all the confusion, which is we are it's a rebellion against God, which is common to all of us, and in this particular realm, seeking to define ourselves and not submitting to God's definition of us.
Yeah. So like last episode, we talked a little bit about suffering, and we talked about sin before, and so can we flesh that out a little bit? Like, so God's the creator. Our bodies are good. He created male and female, and it very uniquely that reflect his image. Then, why does someone feel this way? Then, like, what's going on here? If everything is good, then shouldn't I feel good?
Yeah.
Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's like we've left out a pretty important piece of the puzzle here, and that is the fall or sin. That yes, God created the world, and yes, it's good, but that sin has entered the world, that the world is broken. It's a broken place because of sin, which is rebellion against God. That begins with the first man and has affected all of humanity. All of humanity, meaning me and every human being on this planet has. So the way we see the world, the way we act, they say the doctrine of sin is the most self-evident of Christian doctrines. All you have to do is turn on the news, look at your neighbor, or really look at your own heart, and you will see the doctrine of sin pretty clearly, that there's something wrong with the created order. We don't act, all of us don't act in line with what we were intended to be.
Right, and there's a physical effect, right? And there's a physical effect, I don't have six-pack abs. I'm never going to have six-pack abs, no matter how hard I try, and my body doesn't respond the way that I want it to respond and the way it used to. That's part of the fall. That's part of, I feel certain things, but, that's not necessarily reality.
And the physical, the fall that affects us physically, the obvious things that we notice is our decaying bodies and the way that our bodies fail us all the time, and the physical deformities. But the fall also affected our minds, as well as our emotions and our heart, which is why we can't trust our heart and our emotions. and why we can't trust the way that we think, because that's fallen also, and that's why we're so often wrong. How many times, every time I speak, I'm convinced that I'm right. Obviously, I wouldn't say it, but how many times have I found myself just wrong? I've just made mistakes. I've misunderstood things. I've misheard things. That's part of that fallen nature. Yeah. And so this is not surprising to us that people are feeling in very confusing ways, that there's all sorts of confusion happening, whether it's sexual orientation or gender. From the very beginning, you have that. I mean, we have the distortion of marriage in, by I think chapter 4, you have the mention of Cain's descendants, who has multiple wives, totally destroys God's design for marriage, is completely gone. And then by chapter, whatever it is, we have 15 or 19 or whatever, you have Sodom and Gomorrah, and you have the whole, there's so much confusion, and our sexual natures are certainly subject to the fall, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things as we think through a Christian view on the body, what I love about it is that our hearts are deceitful. We know these things. Jeremiah tells us that our hearts are deceitful things, but God is trustworthy, and He is a good creator, that we could say, although I feel this way, I'm still, like, my body is still good, even though I don't feel that. Let me ask you this, guys, and we'll shift gears here in a second, but does Jesus understand gender dysphoria?
I would say he definitely. I mean, he knows what it is to face temptation of every kind. He's been a human being, but remained without sin. But he knows what it's like to be in a world that is confused, that is confusing. And one person has said that the person who resists temptation the most actually feels it the most. The quicker you give into it, the less you feel the temptation. And I'm not saying Jesus has been tempted with a specific sin, but he knows what it's like to be tempted in all sorts of different ways. And he's sympathetic to that.
Yeah. They say for people who are transgender, that the suicide rate is enormously high. And the level of depression, even after they get fixed or come to a place where they feel affirmed in some way, it's still the depression and the drug use and the suicide rate, and so much of it is stemming from this sense of loneliness and rejection. And I can't tell you, I've seen so many of these little videos I was watching some of these before we came, of people who are dealing with these kind of things and all these identities, and what really struck me is the brokenheartedness of every one of them. As they are describing their experience of being called freaks, and that's how they feel about themselves, of being dehumanized. And I would say those are things our Lord experienced every last bit of it upon the cross. Talk about the most dehumanizing thing that ever happened was what happened to him, and the freakish thing that nailed naked to a cross, despised by every single person, utterly alone there. Yeah, our Lord identifies, and he understands to a degree you will never even know and imagine. I think that's really the cry of the heart of so many dealing with this gender confusion, is this sense of being rejected, of not being loved, and being on the outs, and not even knowing who I am, and just losing the sense of self and identity. That's really at the heart of, I think, of all these things. So I would absolutely affirm you're saying Christ knows. Yeah.
Well, let's shift a little bit of the gear. So we talked about the biblical framework and the biblical Christian view on that. The philosopher Charles Taylor once wrote that our culture is suffering from a malaise of imminence. In other words, there's this collapse of transcendence. There's this collapse of something greater than us. So what does he mean, and how has the malaise of imminence affected our cultural perspective on the body, and maybe specifically gender?
Rick, before you take that, would you explain what transcendence and imminence mean?
Yeah, dude, thanks. I appreciate that.
So a transcendence, a sense of an overarching purpose, something that goes beyond the immediate, beyond even just the physical. God is usually seen as the transcendent, and so the imminent would be the opposite of that. that's which is right in front of us. That was just
Right here.
purely here now. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I'll put a little more meat
Sure.
on the bones on this.
Yeah, yeah.
So like the way that we see this, right, is it's like, okay, there's 72 genders. All right, you could be any gender that you want, and there's more being made up every single day. There's a sense in which there is no creator, there is no transcendence, there is no larger purpose for gender or for my body. So it's all about what I make up.
Yeah.
And so I guess my point, my question is like what's the result of that? Like, what has that affected us? Identity? Like, what's going on here? Because it's super confusing.
I know there have been some atheists that I've read, and they talk about the thrill of realizing that the world is ours to do with what we want because there is no God. And I wonder if the malaise that Charles Taylor's talking about is a little bit like my son this week, where it was a great thrill for him on Sunday to fill his jack-o'-lantern candy thing with candy. I mean, he couldn't believe how heavy that thing was. And this week, we've allowed him, because we want to get rid of the candy as quick as possible, to eat as much of it as he wants. So he's bringing as much to school as he wants, as much after school. While I'm reading bedtime stories, I'm letting him eat candy, because I'm letting him get rid of it. And I can just see as the week's going on, he's just getting more and more sluggish. But it was a thrill at first, I think, to not have the parents' rules saying, limit your chocolate and whatever. And there can be a thrill at first that there is no moral law because there's no moral lawgiver. But I don't know. I think a malaise sets in over us. Once we do all that we want to do, once we construct society as best we can and see how hard it is for anything to work, there's a malaise of imminence, a malaise of a lack of a holy God who loves us and has a purpose for the world.
And so I've heard it phrased this way, that the end of pleasure is boredom.
Yeah.
That's where it always ends up, with boredom. And we talked. I think this is sort of a first world problem in a sense, the gender confusion, because we've been blessed to not have to live in a country where there is no war and strife, where we can go about and live, and there's few typical struggles that people in other countries, third world countries, go through here. And so there is this boredom in Malay. You're trying to find purpose and meaning. You're almost looking for oppression, looking for something to give your life some meaning, which is why so many, I think, people have grabbed on to one of those 72 genders and classified them. How many are coming out now, famous people coming out and declaring themselves, pansexual or demisexual or these things and that. I can't even tell the difference between them, but to be able to say those things and to be so brave in coming out and doing that,
I mean, go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to say, I think what we're kind of getting at is that there is a freedom at first, but where does it end? It ends with nihilism. It ends with a sense of complete meaninglessness. Okay, then if there really is no rule, there really are no rules whatsoever, there is no real moral standard or any purpose to why we're here, then you end with a sense of, well, then there is no meaning to this whole thing. It's sort of a farce. The whole thing doesn't really have any purpose to it. So I think that's what's happened. We've lost the transcendent. I think for most of history, people have lived with a sense of, I'm here, I have responsibility, I have my family, I have my job, I have my king, I have my, or queen, I have my God, and I have a duty. Instead of sort of like, well, now we're left with a sort of a nihilism, a sense of, well, there is no real meaning to this whole thing. It's just a comedy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if I can jump in, it comes back to our first discussion on the cross.
Yeah.
That he who finds his life will lose it, but he who loses life for my sake will find it. And the call to discipleship of following Christ is one of denying yourself, taking up your cross and following him. And I think this whole discussion and pursuing these things and defining things for ourselves and this malaise of imminence, it's a self-centeredness that we're trying to make our own meaning, satisfy ourselves, and we don't want to lose ourselves and find the life that Christ promises us.
Right, and then there's this idea in which there's like there's an evolution, like we're discovering, we're becoming a better human being by doing these things. But when we remove transcendence from the picture, it's a weight that we cannot bear because we're not transcendent. We're image bearers. And image bearers cannot bear the weight of the Creator. And so we see this sense in which people are cracking under the pressure. I mean, we're seeing that all around us. I mean, statistics will tell you those things. And so I want to shift a little maybe to something we've heard before that I feel like maybe like years ago, this would have been kind of a statement that would have been like, come on, seriously. But we hear this quite often, you know, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. So what is the philosophy, the undergirding philosophy that's behind this?
You know, I want to address, first of all, before I get the philosophy of it, that I think, my impression is that the church historically has not responded to people with such a struggle in a compassionate way. It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that the church really right now is just starting to say, oh, people have that struggle. How should we respond? I think in the past it might have just been like, that's evil, or you're a freak, or that's wrong, and then end of discussion. And so in a way, I'm hoping the church is beginning to grow by saying, okay, wait, let's listen to what people are experiencing and saying. And for a long time, let's try to process this, and then let's develop compassionate responses to it. So that might be just a starting point that I'd want to say.
Can I push back on that just a minute here? And perhaps we can distinguish. A lot of times we see that the church needs to address certain things, and we're thinking of the church as an institution, needing to address things as an institution. You know, but I think we understand. Look, the church is a people. It's Christians. It's individuals. In one sense, honestly, there are plenty of examples of church not attending, Christians not attending things. It's hard to make a judgment because so much of the real work of the church goes unnoticed. It's by individual Christians who are coming alongside others. And so I'm a little hesitant to throw the church under the bus in that regard and say we've done a lousy job, because I think as individual Christians, I say a lot of individual Christians, believers, have done a wonderful job of coming alongside those with great compassion who are dealing with all sorts of struggles.
That's helpful, yeah.
And I want to distinguish that, because you're right. I mean, there's plenty of Christians and organizations and things like that who are blind to these things, but I think a lot of the work of God continues to just goes unnoticed because it's done in small places by individuals.
Point well taken.
So I just want to
maybe
clarify that a little
Yeah,
bit.
and I think too, sometimes, so it's that difficult balance too of saying we want to be clear. We want to be biblical. We want to be sound in our thinking, and there's sort of a battle of ideas that goes on in the world. And sometimes that clarity can seem offensive or aggressive, and it doesn't necessarily need to be. It's just we want to make sure we are thinking rightly, but on a practical level, and I think we're going to talk a little bit pastoral later on. It's, okay, how do you deal with someone then who walks into your church and says, I'm struggling with this, can you help me? That's a very different conversation than trying to come to a clearer understanding of what these things are. So I think what you're saying is completely true, Dave, but I also think having, working on a clarity of thought on this and what is biblically, accurate is so important too. So,
but to move back closer to Brian's question, so apparently there are a fair number of people today and maybe throughout history, probably to different degrees and different times and places, who have felt in some way alien or alienated from their bodies. And but I think one point of your question, which is what's the philosophy behind that, is now that what is newer today is an idea that who we think we are, our feelings and our thoughts about who we are, overrides even our physical bodies and the biology of it. And so there are philosophical currents that have come together to make the idea that I'm someone saying I'm a woman trapped in a man's body or whatever, and making that seem like, that's accurate and we should support this person in that. I don't know if I could speak to what those currents are, but I know they're there.
Yeah. I mean, we see this idea. I think that one of the things that we tend to think like this is new thought. but this is a dualism of, you know, this is sacred and this is secular, this is good and this is evil. In a real theological way, we could say this is kind of a new Gnosticism, this idea of awakening. We know the special knowledge and all matter is bad, everything in you is good. And we see this real push for adopting this. And I think that really heavily influenced by like Greek philosophers, you know, that kind of dualism. Again, that this is bad and this is good. And we could see this in some throughout history. One of them is the French philosopher René Descartes encapsulated kind of this idea of, I probably said that wrong, but
Descartes.
Whatever, dude. Listen, I'm a Marine. Give me a break. All right, we can edit that out. All right. I thought it was that, but I heard someone else say it. But you know what? We'll laugh about it. So here's the dude, René Descartes. Descartes. Whatever. Okay. Lord have mercy on me. All right, encapsulated this philosophy, that guy, that French guy, he said, I think, therefore I am, which basically in the time was like, if I think, my intellect is who I really am, anything else my body physically is not. What would we say would be like, what would encapsulate our time right now? What would be that saying today? What do you guys?
Well, I think that to kind of defend Descartes a little bit. So Cartesian.
Descartes, right?
Cartesian philosophy. So he believed that the only way we can know reality and know that we exist is through the fact that I am a thinking being, and if I think, therefore I exist. And that he tried to build all of reality from that point onward. But he wouldn't stop there. He wouldn't say thinking is the only reality. It's just the basis of now knowing I exist. And I think what you're saying is that we have now come to the point where my view of reality, my individualism, or maybe relativism of how I see the world is definitive and is it's the authority. So if I see myself as a certain thing, if I see myself as a female and I'm in a male body, then reality needs to conform to my thinking because my thinking is supreme, or vice versa, right? As opposed to I need to conform to reality or I need to conform to something, you know, to my responsibilities in this world and so forth. It's my thinking is now the supreme. It's the most and the most important thing that is. And
it's more of I think now it seems to be I feel, therefore I am. It's how I feel. And I've heard people say this. It was a new thought to me that I've heard actually people argue this, that they've been taught this, that my feelings about things trumps your facts.
Yeah.
You can present facts, but my feelings are more real than whatever fact or objective reality you might state. That's something new, I think. I think we've always had people who have felt not right in their bodies. We've always had that. And I think every one of us feels to different degrees, some of them to extreme degrees, others just slightly, but none of us really feels at home. But what's happening is, concerning in the culture and society, is that it's now encouraged as something, no, there's nothing wrong with you. Whereas before we would say, if you feel like you're a woman trapped in a man's body, something is wrong. We are not allowed to say that anymore. Now it is, no, then you truly are a woman trapped in a man's body, and what's wrong is your body, not your feelings. Whereas before we would say, look, the body's the body. That's a man's body. Your feelings are the problem, and something we maybe got to find a way to work with that.
Right, and it's interesting, we talk about it from this theoretical level, like even now we're talking philosophy and messing up names and it's all great. But here's the thing, when the rubber meets the road, right? It's like you go and we're sitting there and someone says, I feel this. Like, you know, I feel 20 years old, but I'm not 20 years old, right? And there's a sense in which we're all in this, like, the emperor has no clothes, and we're all like, yeah, no, you got clothes, this is good. And I feel like there's a fear. There's a fear, like even us having a conversation right now, like I'm getting a little excited here, even us having a conversation right now, it would be considered hate speech, even though none of us would hate anyone that walked through this door. No. We just have a perspective on it. And I even find it amongst, I'm going to use the word, the church. And when I say the church, I mean like the people that actually like believe in the gospel and like the theologically conservative people that we'd be in communion with are afraid to say things. Pastors are afraid to say things. And here we have a bunch of people that are sitting there going, believers and non-believers, going, I know what I'm seeing is wrong. Doesn't make sense. It's not computing. What do I do?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be on the wrong side of history on this. And I feel like I don't want to be insensitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, you're going to lose either way that you go.
Yeah.
And so my question on this, and I want to kind of turn it into I am going to talk about the church a little bit on this. Have we been complicit in this dualism, this idea? Like, have we been complicit in this?
I'd say yes. And one reason I think might be fear. I think we've been afraid to speak because we're afraid what other people might think. And I was just listening to a podcast about a woman who detransitioned, and what she was saying was very politically incorrect about her regrets of what she had done. And what I realized was, as I was listening, was even though what she was saying probably is not going to get a lot of popular approval, it just seemed right. And there's power in the words that we speak, even when they're unpopular. One of my favorite proverbs is from the book of Proverbs is the tongue has the power of life and death. And I wonder how often we Christians and people of any stripe but have been silenced by fear when just speaking truth, hopefully if done in a gentle way, in a persuasive way, could have been giving life. Yeah.
But speaking truth in certain situations will cost you your livelihood, cost you your job. They will cancel you faster than anything.
Yeah.
If you say the wrong thing, if you misgender someone, if you don't. I remember when Caitlyn Jenner was being presented as the woman of the year, like for an ESPN, like the sportswoman of the year, and everyone is standing up and applauding. And Brett Favre, I think it was, stands up because everyone's standing up, but he doesn't applaud, or doesn't applaud with much vigor, and people were calling him out because he didn't properly, with enough vigor to do this. And the whole, I think social media has amplified it, and people are feeling that pressure. And who wants this trouble? It's like, I just want to live my life. I totally understand it. I just want to go to work and take care of my family. I don't want this. And so if you want to, fine, you can, there are 72 genders, fine, now leave me alone. I think that's the approach, I think. And I totally understand it, because if my livelihood was at stake, I would feel great pressure to just go along. I get it. I completely get it. And that's why for me, it's like I really admire the people who basically can speak out with and take the cost of it. That's inspiring.
We even joked before our our session here. We said this is the last episode of Crossroads, because we know it will be offensive. I do think part of it is to say, well, what is our area of where we can really speak truth into it? So we're not medically able to speak. There are things like intersex and things like that. We're not talking about that, hermaphrodites and so forth. So we understand that. We're not politicians, so we're not talking about what is legal and what is illegal. We're talking from the sphere of pastors and ministers, of saying we want to be clear about the truth. We want to be clear about what the Word says and what God. Like we get to the pastoral day, we want to love people. So love doesn't mean telling them everything they do is okay.
Well, let's just talk about the pastoral now.
Yeah.
So how do you then? So you're talking. So someone comes and they go, Pastor Rick, I need to talk to you. I'm struggling with my gender. I am a man, but I feel like I'm name whatever. And what do you say?
I can tell you not only what would I say, but what have I said, because those are very real situations. So one is that we are all sinners, and that sin affects every one of us. I may not struggle with that particular sin, but I know what it's like to struggle with sin. I may not have gender dysphoria, but I'm sure I have dysphoria, or, as we said, sin that is mental. So it's in the case of a Christian believer who's looking for pastoral advice, I would say this may be a struggle that God has for you. That may be a struggle that you face for life. Just like there are struggles, I'm going to temptations and so forth that I'll face for life. thank God for the gospel, that our salvation is not based on our sanctification and how good we are, but on His grace. But along that path, He gives strength, He enables us. So, I love you would be a good thing to say too.
Yeah.
That this doesn't, thank you for your honesty, this doesn't change my opinion of you, this doesn't change my evaluation of you as a human being, as one made in the image of God, or my love for you in our friendship. Let me help you. Let's talk about what we can do to sort of help you walk into what God has for you. You know, what we believe the Scripture would say God has for you.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I'd want to listen as much as I could. I'd want to learn as much about their experience and how they've come to this point and what they're thinking of doing about it. And I'd want them to feel like I'm a safe person to interact with because I really care. I'd want to pray with them and bring them to God. And even though, you know, I wouldn't feel like I have a lot of answers. I'd have some truths from Scripture I'd want to bring. I do believe that the Holy Spirit is real, and He's the comforter and the counselor and the one who reveals things about us sometimes that we didn't want to know, convicts us of things. And so I do believe that the Spirit can work through His Word and through even ordinary people like me to encourage and help someone along that journey. And I'd want to keep that conversation going.
Yeah.
What about, I'm going to give you a different one, Michael, because,
Okay.
so what about a parent? I'm coming to you, I love my child.
Yeah.
My child is in middle school. My child goes to Amesbury Middle School, right down the street from your church.
Yeah.
And she's struggling with her gender, and I'm embarrassed because of that, but at the same time, I love my kid. There's all these mixtures of feelings that are coming through. What do I do?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great struggle. And I think first thing is to understand with children especially, there is so much confusion. Just the hormones, the stage of life that they're in, the curiosity, the uncertainties, the unknowing things. So one of the biggest mistakes I think that we as parents can make is to overreact to these things. They don't need us sharply rebuking on the one hand, but they also don't need us affirming. There's a sense in which it's not as important as you think it is right now at this stage. We're not talking about someone who's 30 years old, but a child is like this confusion. I remember this, and I shared that story with you before we came in, but a long time ago when I was a kid, one of my cousins was, I think he was 6 or 7 years old, whatever. He was, his mom walked down the stairs and he was kissing his best friend, right? It was a boy. And she handled it with such grace, and we were like, I was a little bit older, we're all kind of sniggering and laughing at this, and she just kind of just wiped it off. It's like, this is nothing. This is nothing. It's not, oh my goodness, my son is homosexual, my son is involved with these things, and this is his identity, I need to affirm this or deny it. It's like, this is just a child, just curious, discovering these things. We all do embarrassing things as children, things later on I can't believe I thought that way. How many of us have been that way? Every one of us. And so there's a sense in which you don't need to overreact on these things and panic with that. What they need from us is a steadiness to know that someone knows what's going on. I don't know what's going on, but mom and dad, they know what's going on. Someone's in charge here. And often what happens is that the parents sort of jump in to affirm or react to, either against or for, and enter into the confusion of the child, which makes things worse, because now they're like, oh my goodness, I thought mom knew what was going on. She seems as confused as I am with these things. And so there's a steadiness of like not to overreact to them, but to love and encourage and and then the second thing I would say to that is there someone planting this confusion in them? Is there a nefarious influence? Is there someone trying to confuse your child? And to root that out, because that is what's happening, is we have teachers in schools, we have neighbors and friends, the media, the news, everything. There are so many forces trying to confuse our children and cause them to think. Almost every single episode of TV now you'll see, someone is experiencing gender confusion and it's being presented in a positive way.
And this kind of goes back to our first episode when we talked about this idea of the satanic. You know, like there's this kind of the world, this like kind of idea which seems right to the world, but there's clearly an agenda here to mar the image, to disrupt that. I mean, this is more theological, but the pastoral aspect of there's like a real enemy that's involved here.
There is. And in some cases, you know, parents may do well to pull their kids out of school or find new friends for them. I still remember we had a very good friend whose son was getting into trouble, or his friends were mistreating him, and it was amazing. He just said the most simple thing. He says, "That's it. We're getting new friends." I mean, it was as if it was that simple. It's like, it is that simple. You get new friends. You know, if you're being bullied or mistreated or confused or led astray, you find new friends.
But you're a Baptist. You split all the time, so you guys are used to having new friends. So okay. Last one. I know we're running out of time. This is something, and this is a real life thing that I've come across a few times. Pastor, my child had, you know, a friend that used to sleep over all the time, and we're close with the family. Now this child is changed genders, and the parents are all about it, and they want to sleep over, and I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to handle the kid or the parents, and I don't want to be shunned from the community as this bigot. What do I do?
Dave wants this one.
Yeah, sure. You know, I guess there's a few things I'd say. One is that we want to treat all people, we want our kids to treat all people with respect and kindness. And we don't want to try, I think a real trap for, particularly for Christians, would be to try to shelter our kids. So that's one thing. And if they were still friends, if my kid was still good friends with that kid and wanted to hang out with them, I don't think I would try and prevent it. I'd want to teach my kid about what the Bible says about gender. And I'd want to, you know, befriend their, you know, I'd want to love their friend as much as possible.
Would you let the kids sleep over?
I think I'm open to that.
Okay.
I'd be open to that. And yeah, I mean, I think they need the influence of Christians. They need to be loved. Now, I think that the other family might draw the line somewhere as we try to engage them. And also, I could see the friendship naturally splitting apart. I mean, because my kids might think that's a bit odd, and they might not connect like they used to, and the friendship might naturally dissolve. But I don't think I would just be like, no, you cannot be friends with such a person who's doing such and such.
Yeah.
And I think we would do well to distinguish between, look, we're all sinners, and we're all distorted and deformed in some way.
Yeah.
But then there are relationships that are sinful, distorted, perverse, and it may be because of a gender thing, but oftentimes it's just you can see it. These kind of it's taking the relationship. Individually, they're probably fine apart, but there's something about this relationship that's taking them to dark places. And so I think we want to measure the relationships of our kids by the direction they're taking, not having a set of rules of like, if so-and-so does drugs, we want nothing to do with him. If so-and-so has gender problems, we want nothing to do with them. Then you basically eliminate everybody in the world because you'll find something significantly wrong. But there are certain relationships where it's like, this relationship is causing my child to become confused.
Yeah.
Now we got problems. You know, this relationship is causing my child to be tempted and to fall into sin in areas that's making him worse. That's a problem. And so I think we have obligations to protect them.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's good.
Well, I just want to close up here and just maybe go around and just maybe some final thoughts that you have. So, you know, or if you have no final thoughts, we'll close it. But maybe start off with you, Michael, and then we'll kind of work our way around. But any final thoughts maybe to some of the things that we've talked about, or something you're like, I would really like you to know this, like from your heart.
I would just say this. One thing, I would have loved to spend a little bit more time on the theology of it, that the male and female is really a big deal, and the marriage union. We're made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And if we get this wrong, we're not understanding who God is. The relationship of the Father and the Son is reflected in the male and the female. The way that God creates, the way that God saves us is reflected in that relationship, and I wish we had a whole episode to dive into that. But also the gospel is at stake, the male and the female reflected in Christ and the church. And so it is an important issue for us as pastors. It's not like other medical issues. This is a big one because this is the one area where God has put his stamp on and said, this is who I am. This is the gospel as you understand it. Christ and the church is the husband and wife, the male and female.
Yeah, our bodies point to a larger reality.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I think it's worth, one thing I'm very thankful for is that the whole gender thing has forced us to think more deeply about this, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
And I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. I guess one final thought I have is that, what matters in the Bible is our relationship with God and our relationship with people. And so this is a God and a people issue, and it's not primarily a political issue. Now, politics relate to God and people, but when I do see a lot of Christians more and more becoming very politicized and being more discipled by current events and those who present those current events or politicians than by the Bible. And so I just want, the political issues are one thing and those matter, but what matters even more is remaining in close connection with God and loving the people around us. It's a real people issue. So
absolutely,
that's just one
thanks,
word.
Dave.
Yeah. Kind of similar to that, Dave, is just thinking of that verse, speaking the truth in love, that we can do both. We can be clear, we can speak biblical truth, we can, in a sense say, this is a confusion, here's what the Bible says here, and do that. And yet you're never going to go wrong with just loving people, right? Mm-hmm. I don't love you because you believe what I believe. I don't only love you because you do what I say. Or anything. We can just love people and say, here's the truth. And if somebody says, well, in order to love me, you have to submit your truth to what I'm believing, then we say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. This is what I believe to be true, but I do love you, and I'm not going to stop loving you just because I don't agree with you. So just that balance. There's no contradiction in the Bible between those two things, loving people and holding firmly to the truth.
Yeah, good word. Those are good words. Well, gentlemen, thank you for engaging in this conversation and just, really just, I think this is scratching the surface. I think we could probably continue on with this and some further and maybe drill down a little bit more in some of these things, but very important issue in our time, and I really appreciate your guys' thoughts and your pastoral wisdom on this. So we thank you for joining us on this episode of Crossroads. And we absolutely want you to know that as pastors, these are real issues for us. These are things that we come across in our everyday. And so, we are praying for you, the listeners of Crossroads, and we hope that you'll join us next time. So thank you for joining us, and God bless.